You have been carrying something that was never yours to carry, and it has been quietly shaping every decision you make, every relationship you enter, every morning you wake up already feeling like you owe someone something, without even knowing why. It is guilt, but not the kind people talk about openly, not the dramatic kind that comes after an obvious mistake. I am talking about the guilt that lives in the background, the guilt that arrives at night when the noise finally stops, the guilt over who you were supposed to become, the parent you meant to be more present for, the friend you kept meaning to call, the work that mattered and kept being postponed, the version of yourself you promised you would find, and never did. You know exactly what I mean. If you're trying to understand yourself on a deeper level, if you're tired of surface-level advice that doesn't actually change anything, subscribe to this channel, because this is where we break down what's really happening inside your mind and what it actually means. And here is what nobody tells you about that guilt. It is not all the same thing. Some of it is pointing you somewhere real. Some of it is a prison someone else built inside you. And if you cannot tell the difference, you will spend your life either running from something you should face or drowning in something you were never meant to carry. Psychology, philosophy, and faith have each been trying to answer this for centuries. And where they arrive is not the same place. The tension between their answers is more honest than any single answer alone. So let us go there. Modern psychology draws a line that most people have never been taught to see. On one side is healthy guilt. It is proportionate. It arises when you have genuinely caused harm to someone. It produces empathy. It moves you toward repair. And then, once the repair is made, it releases. It does its job and moves on. On the other side is toxic guilt, and this one is different. This is the guilt that stays long after any repair has been attempted. Guilt over things outside your control. Guilt inherited from a childhood where love felt like something you had to earn. Guilt that was handed to you by someone who needed you to feel small so they could feel safe. Guilt that stopped being a temporary signal and became a permanent emotional posture. Think about someone who grew up in a home where approval was always slightly out of reach, where affection came with conditions attached. That person learned early that feeling guilty was the price of belonging. And decades later, long after leaving that home, the guilt is still there, not because they did something wrong, but because the pattern was written so deeply into their nervous system that it became the default state. Psychology calls this pathological guilt, and the research is clear. Chronic unresolved guilt is linked to depression, anxiety, procrastination, and a slow erosion of self-worth that makes it almost impossible to move forward. Studies have even found that people recalling personal failures report feeling physically heavier. The guilt was not just emotional, it was embodied. It lived in the body. So psychology says, examine the guilt. Assess whether it is proportionate to any real harm. Challenge the distorted thinking that sustains it. Learn to release what was never yours to carry. There is real wisdom in that. But here is the limit. Psychology does not always acknowledge. Its entire framework for guilt is built around functionality. It asks whether the guilt is helping you or harming you, whether it is proportionate or distorted. And those are important questions. But they are not the only questions, because psychology cannot tell you whether what you feel guilty about actually matters morally. It can measure the emotional weight of the guilt, but it cannot weigh the moral reality the guilt might be pointing toward, and that gap Between the feeling and the meaning is exactly where philosophy enters. Philosophy looks at guilt and asks a prior question, a more uncomfortable one. What if guilt is not a malfunction? What if it is a faculty? Aristotle argued that the virtuous person is not someone who never feels guilt, but someone whose guilt is accurately calibrated, whose moral emotions are aligned with moral reality, which means the person who feels nothing after genuinely harming another is not psychologically liberated. He is morally deficient. He has lost contact with something essential about what it means to live well among other human beings. Think about that. We live in a culture that tells us to release guilt as quickly as possible, to practice self-forgiveness, to move on, and sometimes that is exactly right. But Aristotle is pointing at something we rarely consider. What if moving on too quickly is itself a form of moral failure? What if the discomfort of guilt is not the problem to be solved, but the signal to be followed? Kant pushed this further. He argued that genuine moral seriousness will always produce the weight of guilt in a person who has actually failed, and that dissolving that weight too quickly through self-forgiveness might be a form of evasion, accountability disguised as self-care. But philosophy is not unified here, and the internal tension is worth sitting with. The Stoics disagreed sharply. Epictetus argued that dwelling in guilt over past actions is irrational because the past is not within your control, and what is not within your control should not govern your inner state. The Stoic response to moral failure is not prolonged guilt. It is clear-eyed acknowledgement, behavioral correction going forward, and then release. Not because the failure did not matter, but because guilt that persists after genuine acknowledgement produces no further moral benefit. It only produces suffering. So philosophy hands us attention psychology does not fully engage with. Guilt may be a morally necessary signal, and prolonged guilt may simultaneously be a failure of reason. Both can be true at once. And living honestly between those two truths requires something more than technique. It requires what faith has been trying to describe for a very long time. Faith looks at guilt and gives it a different name entirely. It calls it conviction. And the difference between guilt as dysfunction, guilt as signal, and guilt as conviction is not just a matter of language. It is a difference in what guilt is ultimately about. Conviction in the theological sense is not simply the emotional experience of feeling bad about something you did. It is the recognition that you have violated something sacred, something that has weight, not because society says so, not because your upbringing says so, but because it is grounded in the nature of reality itself. The Christian tradition makes a distinction here that cuts directly to the heart of the matter. The first epistle of John separates what it calls godly sorrow from worldly sorrow. Godly sorrow leads to repentance, to genuine change, to restoration. Worldly sorrow leads only to death, meaning the guilt that turns inward and feeds on itself. The guilt that becomes self-punishment without transformation is not what faith endorses. Faith endorses the guilt that moves, that brings a person to his knees not to stay there, but to rise differently. And this is where forgiveness enters, not as a psychological technique for releasing negative emotion, but as a theological reality. The claim that the debt created by genuine moral failure can be genuinely cancelled. Toujours, not minimized, not gradually forgotten, not reframed into something more comfortable, but actually resolved. And that resolution does not come through the person working hard enough to deserve it. It comes through grace, through something, given rather than earned. Carl Jung reflected on this in a way that is worth sitting with. He wrote that living honestly with ourselves requires the same virtues we are supposed to extend to others: patience, love, faith, hope, humility. And then he asked something that cuts deep. What if I am the one who most needs my own compassion? What if the person I most struggle to forgive is myself? That question lands differently than most psychological advice, because it is not asking you to release guilt through technique. It is asking whether you have genuinely extended to yourself the same grace you would offer someone you love. But here is the tension faith must honestly sit with. If forgiveness is freely given, if guilt can be genuinely resolved through repentance and grace, then why do so many sincere people continue carrying guilt long after they have sought forgiveness? Why does the conscience sometimes refuse to accept what has already been declared settled? Why do people who genuinely believe in grace still wake at 3 in the morning under the weight of what they did? That gap between declared forgiveness and felt forgiveness is one of the most honest and painful realities in the life of faith, and neither psychology nor philosophy fully accounts for it. So here is where the three traditions meet, and where they most honestly diverge. Psychology sees that guilt can become pathological, inherited rather than earned, weaponized rather than genuinely felt, disproportionate to any real harm. And in those forms it must be examined and released rather than obeyed. This is true, but psychology risks offering relief without accountability. And relief without accountability is not healing. It is avoidance with better language. Philosophy sees that guilt is morally serious, that it registers a real gap between who you are and who you know you ought to be, and that dissolving it too quickly may be moral evasion. This is also true, but philosophy risks leaving a person alone with his conscience and no path to resolution, because knowing you failed does not by itself repair the failure. And the person who carries guilt with full philosophical seriousness, but no mechanism for genuine forgiveness, can become a prisoner of his own moral clarity, not more virtuous, just more burdened. Faith sees that guilt is a convicting voice pointing toward something sacred, and that genuine resolution requires more than reframing and more than accountability. It requires forgiveness, actual forgiveness, not just feeling better, but being genuinely released. This is the most radical claim of the three. But faith must honestly face the reality that declared forgiveness and felt forgiveness are not always the same experience. And that gap is not always evidence of weak faith. Sometimes it is simply evidence of being human, what each tradition sees that the others miss. Psychology gives you the mechanics, but risks losing the meaning. Philosophy gives you the moral seriousness, but risks losing the mercy. Faith gives you the mercy, but sometimes underestimates the slow and unglamorous work of actually changing. A person trying to carry guilt honestly needs all three, not as a comfortable agreement where everyone nods, but as a living tension that keeps the question real. Because the moment you let one tradition silence the others, you lose something true about what it means to be human. So the next time guilt visits you, do not rush to silence it, but do not worship it either. Ask first whether it is proportionate, whether it is pointing at something real or at something inherited and distorted. Ask what it is actually calling you toward: repair, honesty, a change that keeps being postponed, an apology that has been too long delayed. Follow it toward accountability, not away from it toward comfort. And if you find that the guilt has done its work, that it has led you to genuine acknowledgement and genuine change, then allow yourself to receive what philosophy cannot give you, and psychology can only approximate: the possibility that you are not simply the sum of your worst moments, that the failure is real, and the forgiveness is also real, because carrying guilt beyond the point where it has done its work is not humility. It is a refusal to believe that transformation is actually possible. The goal is not to become a person who never fails. That person does not exist. The goal is to become a person who knows what to do when he fails, who can look at his guilt without running from it or drowning in it, who can follow it to where it leads and then rise, not unchanged, but because of the weight he carried and set down, more genuinely himself than he was before. And if this made you see something differently, if this gave you clarity that you didn't have before, subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning, and the next video might explain something about yourself that you've been trying to understand for years.